Lasky is editor-in-chief of World, a magazine that defines itself as dependent on God and independent of any political or interest group. Deseret News reporter Mark Kellner sits down with Marvin to discuss the problems with America's welfare system and why he believes it needs more religion.
When you wrote your book, The Tragedy of American Compassion, right. And if I understood the thesis, basically, we were doing a lot as a society to meet material needs, but leaving the spiritual brokenness, the personal brokenness right. of people untended to. Number one, has that changed at all in society? And if it hasn't changed, what can we do to start fixing it?
Well, it's changed over a long period. That book you referred to, The Tragedy of American Compassion, is basically a history book. And so I was writing about what Americans in the 18th, 19th, and really the 20th century up until 1930 were used to doing. In other words, when there was a problem, the first impulse was not, we need a federal program to fix it. It was, what can I do to help? And so you did see people engaged in that person-to-person effective compassion. They offered challenging personal and spiritual help. That started changing in the 1930s during the Depression and the growth of the New Deal. The government could have tried to bulwark the existing groups, but a lot of them were church-related, and the folks in the Roosevelt administration really didn't want to do that, so they set up a counter system, a federal welfare system, starting in the 1930s when there was still an emphasis on work, but then in the 1960s really changed, and it became just essentially passing out money to people whether they worked or not. There was an attempt to fix in the 1990s with what was called the Republican Revolution of 1994, 20 years ago. It worked a little bit, didn't go very far, and now we're pretty much back in the same position of a lot of people just sitting back and expecting someone to give stuff to them, and people who are capable of helping saying, well, I'm paying lots of taxes for it, so I don't have to get involved, let the professionals do it. Well, the professionals are not doing a great job at it, and so we're really deep in the big muddy at this point.
What's the way out?
The way out is to, well, two things. I mean, number one, I can talk programmatically to do things where individuals would be pushed to help and even given some incentives to help. I mean, for example, I used to go around the country and speaking, and I would ask audiences, okay, if you had an option, instead of sending, let's say, $500 to the Federal Department of Health and Human Services to be dispersed with the tender kindness that goes along with that bureaucracy, if you could actually send that money to some other agency, a local agency that you know of that you think would do a better job with that $500 than HHS, would you want to do that? Do you have a group in mind that you think would do a better job? And really going around the country for years asking that question, hundreds of people would raise their hands. If I asked, well, would you send the money to the federal government, there were about 3 people maybe that I can recall, and all those crowds raising their hands, and all 3 of those were professors. So that's number one. There are programmatic things that can be done through tax incentives and credits and things like that. But number two, it's really not going to work unless there's a spiritual change in the people who have a willingness to give. I mean, that's what's required. What we really need is the attitude of the Good Samaritan who, didn't pass by the guy who had been mugged and was hurting badly in the street. Right. And he also didn't go to Jerusalem and say, well, I want a piece of legislation whereby there'll be, groups that come and bureaucrats who do that. In fact, he got personally involved, and he was commended by Jesus for doing that. This was the story Jesus told. That's what we need. I mean, we need more personal willingness to get involved, but that's unlikely to happen as long as the government soaks up so much money and people are often working second jobs to pay their taxes. So you need both the programmatic change and the personal change. You need both. Won't work without the other. Which comes first? It's somewhat of a chicken and egg problem. It's probably at this point we need to see people stepping up, and even under the heavy burden of taxation and all the other things involved, people still volunteering in their neighborhoods, like these folks fixing bicycles in Atlanta or setting up rides in Tennessee.
Have we reached a tipping point in society, do you believe, where people are willing to go that extra mile to take those steps, or do we yet have something have to happen before society as a whole starts acting?
Well, we have the tipping point in theory. In other words, if you ask people about this, people will say, well, sure, that's what should happen. In practice, are people willing to do it? There are some, and that's why we, in World, we like to tell those stories. Are there enough? Not right now. It's going to really require, I think, a spiritual change as well as a programmatic change.
You've been sounding the themes of more responsible journalism and in society, individual responsibility for helping others for a number of years now. Are you an optimist still, or a pessimist, or are you neutral?
Well, I'm a long-range optimist. I believe in Jesus Christ, and things are going to work out. This is all within God's plan. That's very long range. You know, in the short run, you know, I'm encouraged whenever I see these folks who are just stepping up and doing it, and there are lots of them all over the place. But as a society as a whole, I think in many ways we have such a bias against God in many ways. I mean, that's putting it crudely, but essentially, the most effective programs I've seen are programs that are religious programs. And if we are trying to discourage in many ways those programs because we fear any governmental involvement with religion, then we have a real problem.
Marvin Olasky with Mark Kellner of the Deseret News. Up next, counting down to Thanksgiving. Richard and Linda Eyre have a new book out that can influence your attitude about gratitude. Then we'll go coast to coast with Network News reporter Harry Smith, what he's learned about the country that he's been covering for a quarter century.